The title of my project is The Influence of Traditional Irish Music. I became interested in this topic because I took SOA 250 abroad in Dublin during May term. I thoroughly enjoyed my time there, and I had the opportunity to experience traditional Irish music in pubs and bars even now in the 21st century. In my research paper, I discussed the influence of traditional Irish music on politics in Ireland, how other cultures influenced the beginning of Irish musical traditions, and how traditional Irish instruments are used today. In this first part of my presentation, I'm going to support one of my original 3 claims. Before beginning the research for the paper, I believed that Irish music heavily affected politics based on what I learned when I took SOA 250 in Dublin. Ireland was controlled by England until the end of the 20th century, and Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. By 1541, England had gained full control of Ireland, and Englishmen who moved to Ireland began to claim Gaelic national identity as their own. This conflict over national identity caused many altercations between Irishmen who resented the English for stealing their nation and culture, and the Englishmen who exerted control. Traditional Irish music was a key area that Irishmen believed to belong to their roots, and they refused to allow the English to take control of folk tunes and use it to their advantage. Folk tunes in particular tied them to their roots and their origins and reminded Irishmen where they came from. Instead, poets, harpers, bards, and pipers became influential in rebellions. In 1601 and 1602, when the Irish briefly took control back from the English, these musicians were pardoned by the Irish because of their effect that they had and the importance that they had on the Irish culture. But when the English regained control in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I ordered that Irish musicians be executed. She knew the influence they had on the mobilization of Irish forces and rebellions, and she knew that as long as musicians continued to live within society, they would remind the Irish of their origins and continue to fuel the nationalism that began the rebellions against the English. In the 18th century, musicians began to tie together folk tunes with street ballads and other lyrics that united the Irish against the English. One quote that I used in my paper to expand upon this idea was written by James O'Connell, and he says that the rebel songs came under the influence of the United Irishmen of the 1798 rebellion, indicated the move from the white cockade of the Stuarts and the blue flag to support for the green and the green flag. This quote illustrates that Irishmen who had previously abandoned their heritage and supported the English returned to their Gaelic roots when they heard the powerful lyrics that fueled their nationalism and reminded them where they came from in tandem with the folk tunes that they had grown up hearing. The messages behind the folk tunes became as important as the music itself, but the music is what reminded them of their loyalty to their own culture. The songs were songs of the oppressed, but they also belonged to a people with great connection to their national identity and past memories. Folk tunes fueled nationalism, which in turn helped Irishmen maintain the belief that the English could and would eventually be overthrown. Throughout the entirety of Irish history under English rule, these folk tunes and the lyrics tied to them were used by musicians to mobilize the Irish people against the English. Religion in Ireland was heavily affected by politics and political differences. Prior to the arrival of the English in 1541, Ireland was a very Catholic nation. However, the English, who had shifted to Protestantism under Henry VIII due to his desire to divorce his wives, imposed their religion on the people of Ireland and forced them to convert to Protestantism through fear tactics and political oppression. The Protestant Church incorporated English musical traditions rather than traditional Irish music, but because musicians were held in such high esteem by the Irish community, many Irishmen participated in music in the Protestant Church. According to O'Connell, during this era in which people were poor and which and in which their religion was outlawed, it was also an era in which poets and musicians and composers combined to create much beauty. In 1742, when the Irish music tradition had become known around the world, Handel premiered his Messiah in Dublin. The Protestant Church tried to assume authority for the management and presentation of the piece, but the Irish people wisely were justly angered by the Church's claim. In their eyes, Handel had chosen to premiere his work in Dublin because of his appreciation for Ireland and its rich musical traditions, not because of the English Church. Ireland still performs the Messiah in Dublin every year on Fishamble Street, where it was first premiered. In this next portion of the presentation, I'm going to support my second claim that Irish music was heavily affected by closely and distantly related cultures. Through my research, I also discovered that Irish music had positive effects on Irish communities in other countries, specifically the United States, which I had not considered prior to beginning my research. I already presented the influence of the English in religion and religious music, but the English also affected other aspects of music tradition in Ireland not related to Catholicism and Protestantism. The rule of England over Ireland caused Irish music to eventually adopt certain English traits. Because military presence was so high, the many concerts given by the army that featured flute solos eventually resulted in the inclusion of the flute in traditional Irish music. When Irish emigrants who had been chased away by famine or political strife began to return from America and England, they brought flutes with them, which increased the presence of flutes and flute music in Ireland and caused it to gain popularity. Native Irishmen bringing flutes back also caused the Irish people to gain respect and to gain trust for the flute that had originally been introduced by the English, who they didn't really like. Another notable influence on Irish music was made by English nobleman Richard Boyle. Like other notable European nations, English noblemen had court musicians. When Boyle immigrated to Ireland, he decided that he wanted to prove to other Englishmen that he was not inferior to them for moving to Ireland by building a court that rivaled any court in England. He later sent several musicians on tour through England and other parts of Europe, which resulted in an increase in curiosity and respect for Ireland and its musical traditions. Richard Boyle's introduction of courts to Ireland also paved the way for other noblemen in Ireland to create music courts and to have court musicians, which introduced a new way that the Irish music influenced people who had influence in other countries. Irish music was also affected by older and more distantly related cultures. The early Irish harp is one of the earliest harps we hear about today, but it was definitely not the first version of the harp. Ancient Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations had built the harp long before Ireland. Experts say that the Irish triangular harp most likely derived from the non-triangular lyres made popular by early Celtic societies in Europe. Irish music in general was also affected by Middle Eastern practices more than those of the more popular European Baroque and classical styles. Rather than virtuosity, Irish music contains ornamentation and melodies that listeners enjoy and remember and are able to sing along with. Other than its influence from England, traditional Irish music actually has more similarities to cultures such as ancient Egypt, civilizations that ran along the northern coast of Africa and into medieval Spain, and Sumeria than Western music. Irish music also had the ability to unite Irish societies in America that were oppressed by American society, and they used Irish instrumental music, dance, and song to unify major Irish enclaves in places like New York, Boston, Chicago, and other major cities with large Irish populations. I took this picture of one of the last 12 remaining early Irish harps, in the library of Trinity College in Dublin when I was there in May. For a long time, this harp was considered to belong to the last High King of Ireland, who was killed in battle in 1014. But now it's actually believed to have been created later in the Middle Ages, I believe. Now, more than 1,000 years after the first appearance of the Irish harp, it remains the national symbol of Ireland and the Guinness factory. It's one of the most recognizable instruments in the world. Sadly, no living person knows how to play the Irish harp. Students who had originally learned from established teachers how to play it died before finding students who were willing to learn the complications of it. Instead, the easier, romantic version of the harp gained popularity because it was easier to play. Recently, there has been a newfound interest in the early harp, though, and the Historical Harp Society of Ireland has commissioned a new line of early Irish harps and will be offering regular classes to teach students how to play them in an effort to preserve this piece of Irish history. In addition to the Irish harp, other instruments such as the transverse flute and Uilleann pipes are still used in traditional Irish music. Transverse flutes first appeared in the early 18th century and are now used by Irish folk bands like the Chieftains. Uilleann pipes, on the other hand, were associated with royalty, and they're now used to commemorate battles and political events. The picture above is of a transverse flute. Ireland has a fascinating cultural and musical history very different from other European countries, and I'm really glad I had the opportunity to research those traditions. Traditional Irish music truly holds enough importance and influence to have affected political dynamics, popularized ancient music techniques and instruments, and retained significance even in the 21st century. If you have any more questions for me, please feel free to put them in the discussion below, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope that you learned something from the research.